So just really quickly, these are the events that we used as key events, and I think people in this room know what these are. The only thing I'll mention is that because of the original theory here, part of the reason I included the Malaysian Airlines flight is because it had a sort of different political character than some of the other events. But I'm happy to talk more about this later on if we want to. So this is the results for Russian users, and what you see here is that we find some shifts at some of our key points. We also have a weird little dip here in the middle that we still have not been completely able to explain around. I don't have a pointer here, do I? Right before, you'll see right before the Malaysian Airlines period. But what you really notice is the big shift happens around the time that Yanukovych flees and Crimea starts, which happens essentially concurrently. And what happens during that period of time is that we see a huge increase in the proportion of tweets sent by Russian users in Russian. Before that period, you see ranging from 40 to about 65%, and after that period, you jump up to the 80 to 90% of tweets being sent in Russian. So this actually matches our expectations. But this is what happens when you look at Ukrainian users. What you should expect based on our expectations is that you would find parallel trends, right? That you would also see, you would expect this on the right is the proportion of tweets sent in Ukrainian. So if our sort of expectations were met, what you would expect is the Ukrainian graph to look identical to the Russian graph. What we find instead is that at the exact same point in time, Ukrainians also begin using significantly more Russian. And this doesn't just happen for a few days. That increased use of Russian is then sustained throughout the remainder of our period of research observation. So instead of finding sort of these diverging trends, we find these parallel trends, right? So this obviously doesn't fit into our theory. Josh mentioned some of the reasons why this might be the case, right? The first is that our theory is wrong. It may be that most of the ethnicity activation literature is about longer term periods of ethnicity activation. It may be that you just don't see changes in the short term. It may be that our operationalization is unsuccessful. But we sort of thought that these trends in and of themselves were an interesting finding. They weren't what we expected to find. But we found it really interesting to note that following this sort of period, this sort of particular moment of crisis, we see this increase in the use of Russian across both groups of people, and that this then sustains as a change. So there's a few alternate explanations, and I'll start with some of the technical ones. The first is that we include retweets in our analysis, which essentially means that a tweet that's retweeted a lot is getting counted multiple times. And we might not think that just because you retweet something in Russian, that has anything to do with your choice of language use. You're retweeting it because it's a Ukrainian, you understand it, and you want to pass it on, and it's in Russian. So we took the retweets out, and we used only original tweets in the data set, which decreases the sample size, so you'll see a little bit more noise, particularly in the Ukrainian. And so, because one idea is that maybe following the beginning of the crisis in Crimea, Ukrainians are retweeting Russians more, right? But this doesn't seem to be the case. The patterns, you do see more noise in the Ukrainian sample, where because the sample size goes down largely, but you don't really see a significant change in the trend over time. So another explanation that many people have asked us about is bots, and what role government bots might play in this. We know that the Russian state, and possibly the Ukrainian state as well, use bots and trolls. And so this would cause an increase in Russian in the data set without necessarily indicating an increase in the use of Russian by the people that we really care about the most, right? So there's been some research in our lab by Sergei Sanovich, Dennis Stukel, and Josh Tucker about how to identify bots. And they've come up with some very preliminary sort of findings about how you might do that. And we applied one of them here, which is to look for suspicious ratios of friends to followers, right? So people who nobody is following, but who are following a whole lot of people. And they've found that they can successfully identify at least a subset of bots using this methodology. So we applied this to our data set and removed what we thought might be bots. basically anything that looked suspicious, which was about 8 to 9% of the data set. So we removed that, and you can see that the overall trend still does not change, right? You still find this exact same trend. And this, with the bots removed, is also, no, I'm sorry, it's not. So this is with the suspected bots removed. Okay, so let's talk about some non-technical reasons why this might be happening. One alternative explanation is that we're talking about different users and different types of users. Maybe this is at the aggregate level, so maybe the people who want to talk about Crimea are different from the people who want to talk about Maidan. Maybe they're actually different individuals with different sets of preferences who therefore have different online behaviors. So then what we're seeing is not a change in behavior, but a change in who is behaving. And I'll talk a little at the end about where we're going forward, but one of the things we want to do is to try to move this analysis to the individual level to try to look at whether what we're seeing is really just a change in who's tweeting and not a change in how they're tweeting. One piece of evidence that this is maybe not the only thing that's going on, this is the number of tweets sent by Russian and Ukrainian users over time. And what you see here is that while there's a huge spike happening at the point that we are discussing, there's a reequilibration back to close to the level that it was before. Now, for Russian users, you do see some sustained increase in the number of users, but that doesn't tell us very much about the Ukrainian users themselves. And the reason that this is important is what it means, particularly for Ukrainian users, is if these are different users, right at that moment of transition, we have to see a whole bunch of people opting out and a whole bunch of people opting in, and that sort of shift remaining the same, for that to be the only explanation. So we think there's at least something else going on here. Another explanation, possible explanation, is about common language communication. So Russian is more universally understood than Ukrainian, in the sense that most Ukrainians can understand Russian, some Russians would have more trouble with Ukrainian, and it can be used as an international language more easily, whereas Ukrainian is predominantly a domestic language. So perhaps during crises, you revert to the most commonly spoken language, and if ethnicity isn't central to what's going on, if our original hypothesis is really completely wrong, then what you might be doing is trying to maximize communication and the efficacy of information spread. This doesn't explain as much why there's so much Ukrainian among Russian users early on that then shifts at that same period, but it's one of the things that we're considering moving forward. And the final alternate explanation is about situational communication, and this is more about the idea of international groups. So language shifts as Russia becomes a bigger player, and maybe what's happening is that there's a difference in how people communicate when the audience is dominantly domestic, as opposed to when the audience is both domestic and international. And importantly, we don't include English in this analysis. So one of the things that we are also looking at moving forward, and we've done some preliminary analyses on this, is what happens when you do include Russian. Is there sort of a substitution effect where people stop using English as much and start using Russian more, for example? So in terms of next steps, and I'm putting these next steps up here so that you kind of know where we're going as you frame questions, where this paper is forthcoming in the Journal of Comparative Economics, but we're moving forward with two other lines of research. One is to try to get at this ethnicity salience in a more direct way, to try to look at the actual content of the tweets, the actual what people are actually saying, and to see whether we see increases in language that calls on ethno-national themes, and in other words, to try to get a better sense more directly without using sort of this proxy that we use in this paper of what's potentially going on online in terms of conversations around ethnicity during crisis. And this is going to focus primarily on Ukrainian users for the reasons that Josh touched on earlier. And we'd also here like to shift the analysis from the aggregate to the individual level, and to maybe also look at what people are doing outside of crisis. So do we see a shift in the way that people talk more normally on Twitter versus the way that they talk during crises on Twitter? Then we also think that this language trend in and of itself is an interesting research question. Are people using language in a strategic way? Are they making choices about what language that they use in order to maximize the impact of what they say, in order to speak to a different sort of audience. And how does this interact with the use of English and with other sorts of international languages potentially being used to communicate with the international community, or having even the perception that you have the capacity to communicate with the international community, however effective that may be. And so for this, we'd also like to look at, we'd like to add English back in a more systematic way. We'd like to look at the relationship between language use and political sentiment, and also to bring in networks, because while eliminating retweets does a lot to help eliminate some of those concerns, one of the things that might be the case is that if several key members of your network switch the language they're using, you switch your language as well, but it's in response to network effects rather than your individual effects. So these were some questions that we would love feedback on for this paper, either discussion now or later on, and also feel free, please, to bring up any other comments that you had. I'm really looking forward to your feedback. So we'd love to hear other explanations for these language trends that you guys might have as Ukraine experts. I'm interested in thinking about what might be the situation for English-speaking users on Twitter, so users who choose English as their Twitter language. Right now they're excluded, but I wonder who people think those people are and whether it's worth bringing those people back in. Whether people have other suggestions for sort of the language strategy analysis that I mentioned there at the end, and then what people think are the most important factors moving forward in terms of trying to get more at these ideas of ethno-national questions. And we'll, yeah, that's my last slide, but I will just briefly show you, this is our lab. All of them are in some way connected with us because they all provide great feedback. So
okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you so much.